Hey there, Studio Asians. Today, we discuss a key question in military affairs. Who has the upper hand in the US-China military showdown? This is a topic that's keeping military brass in Asia and the US up at night. I've been digging into this topic and have found some fascinating insights. We will also have comments from military experts who've spent decades in the Indo-Pacific, both in the air and on the high seas. They have visited Chinese warships and talked to the People's Liberation Army officers. Some were even fired by the US authorities over a decade ago for critical opinions. So let's dive into this story. It's about an underdog's rise to the top, and the former champ helping him along the way. It's a crazy tale, and it starts back in the late 80s.
Introduction: Eastern Europe and China.
Remember the Cold War? At the end of the 80s, the Iron Curtain fell. The Soviet Union and its allies began their journey to capitalism. Eastern Europe was changing fast. Militaries were being dismantled. Countries were shifting to a market economy.
It is my great honor to welcome to the White House the President of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev.
At the same time, on the other end of the Euro-Asian continent, the CCP was also embracing the free market, with one big difference. More on that in a moment. The 90s were called the end of history. In a decade of the peace dividend, Eastern Europe and China were transitioning. The West widely believed they were on the right side of history. The US military proved its dominance in the Yugoslav wars, the Second Gulf War, and the 1995-96 Taiwan crisis. We now look at the first example of the American military dominance, the Second Gulf War in 1991.
The globally dominating U.S. Army.
The U.S. Army's efficiency in the Iraq invasion shocked and scared many governments, especially the Chinese one. The CCP wanted to dethrone the U.S. economically and militarily. After the quick success of the 1991 Gulf War, the Chinese party realized there was an abyss between their PLA and the U.S. military. We now look at the second example of American global dominance at a Chinese provocation and how it backfired.
China's dictatorial party.
Until the end of the 80s, some Asian countries were still authoritarian or very corrupt, like China and Taiwan, South Korea, and the Philippines. But like Eastern Europe, also South Korea, the Philippines, and Taiwan began to transition to democracies at the end of the 80s. Eastern Europe was dismantling its security forces to join the EU and NATO. The CCP, on the other hand, massacred its own citizens in 1989 on Tiananmen Square. It continued its dictatorial rule. It stepped up surveillance and censorship, promoted aggressive nationalism and militarization with significant intensity, plus territorial expansion. The result of those tendencies was a clash with neighboring Taiwan in the mid-90s. This country was on the opposite path from China and on its way to democracy. This country had presidential elections scheduled for March 1996, and the CCP was very displeased. You know, those elections that hurt Chinese dictatorial feelings and such. To scare Taiwanese voters and help a pro-China candidate, the CCP leadership sent a warning to its beloved compatriots. The warning was in the form of Dongfeng 15, M9, and HJ-8 missiles. The Clinton administration reacted to this aggression and deployed 2 aircraft carrier battle groups along the strait. Did President Clinton do the right thing? Was it interference in internal Chinese affairs? And again, same as with the Gulf War, the CCP could only watch and envy the might of the U.S. Navy. Even worse, this time at its own shore.
And we are here to ensure the stability and ensure that that is all done peacefully. And the carrier's part in that, though, is a normal training that we do, be it off this coast or anywhere else.
This had to change, and so it did.
China's regional domination.
During the 1990s and 2010, the U.S. Army didn't have a competitor. Not even close. Maybe this explained the compliance and naivete of its officers when confronted with the rising might of the Chinese military. Here are some examples of how gullible American armed forces high-ranking officers were We quote an excellent article by a top expert on Taiwan and China, retired U.S. Marine Colonel Grant Newsham.
The Americans were accommodating them at every step. The U.S. military was keen to engage in exercises, exchange visits, and key leader engagements. Too many top officers wanted to add visited China and met my counterparts to their resume. Ray Odierno, then Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, said while visiting China in 2014, he welcomed a strong Chinese military. This was not an unusual sentiment at the top levels, although the lance corporals and sailors who would do most of the dying in a war perhaps thought differently. ADM Samuel Locklear, former U.S. INDOPACOM commander, said that climate change was his main worry. The PLA was not even on the list of his concerns.
But shouldn't our military be more like that?
You fucked with the wrong Marine!
So no matter how wide the difference in development between the U.S. and Chinese forces back then, things started changing. In over 2 decades, the PLA went from a modest green water to a proud blue water navy and operates now globally. Their rocket force is now a serious challenge to all neighbors, including to the American military. I am going to focus here purely on the current condition of the PLA, not on how it got here. You will then know exactly how good or how bad the PLA is. After a 2-decade growth, the CCP began challenging most of its neighbors, also established military powers, who even a decade ago were out of the PLA's reach. So why does the PLA behave so aggressively? Because it can. Because there is absolutely no response from the victims. Oh no, I forgot. There is some. There's a lot of public complaining, calling in Chinese ambassadors and condemnations by spokespeople. There are also the countless visits by foreign officials in Beijing. Because yes, if we only explain the problem to the CCP this one more time, they definitely will understand. And a more cynical person would say, it's words against steel and intimidation. But hey, maybe I am just exaggerating. It's not as bad, right? It can't be. Okay, let's see. Is there a way to measure the progress of the Chinese military buildup? Yes, there is. We can look at the hardware, the quantity and quality of their arms and military infrastructure. We can also evaluate their exercises. How much and frequently the Chinese military exercises? How do the branches cooperate? Their interoperability. Do they cooperate with other armies? Let's listen to Ian Easton, one of the most respected China and Taiwan hands. He wrote 2 bestsellers. Here is his opinion on the Chinese military.
They're engaged in what is probably the largest sustained armaments program that the world has witnessed in 100 years. I think we should assume that the PLA is going to perform very, very well.
Yes.
That we are dealing with, this is an adversary that could beat us, that they could beat the Taiwanese and they could even beat the Americans. And they could even beat the Taiwanese and the Americans fighting together, which of course...
Here is another insider opinion from Air Force General David Stilwell, a career fighter pilot. He was the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs and a defense attaché to China. He is speaking here about the Hainan incident in April 2001.
These guys are getting closer for one reason, and that's to annoy, harass, scare, message Australian, Canadian, American aircraft operating cowboys. They're doing things like holding their email addresses up on the cockpit, flying with their left hand, having a hard time keeping control of the airplane. And this guy thinks he's being funny. So he basically tried to murder, a whole crew of P-3 pilots through his irresponsible actions. And that's not overstating it at operating. I hope guys who get this recording and others get this message out very clearly. PLA Air Force, PLA Navy, Air Force are not ready for prime time.
The next step after China's regional domination is
China's global domination.
And here it really gets worse and more depressing. Our trade imbalance and decades-long shift of manufacturing to Asia have made us more dependent on that region. This manufacturing and technology transfer to the Orient is one of the reasons for our lack of military readiness. The West doesn't have the proper manufacturing base anymore. We often even lack engineers and specialists in production and engineering. We have trouble even starting projects like AUKUS. This cooperation aims to create a new nuclear-powered submarine fleet for Australia. In this particular case, Western partners lack enough wharves, engineers, and funds. The U.S. can't build and maintain even a minimum amount of ships for the Navy and has to ask Asian allies for help. Here is Captain James Fanell, a highly respected Navy officer. He was the Director of Intelligence and Information Operations at U.S. Pacific Fleet.
Two things on this. I've been somebody that's been quite vocal to say that this idea that you always hear from these commentators that China hasn't fought a Navy war since 1949, and therefore they don't have any experience, but the U.S. does. I would say what gives navies experience is being at sea. So I spent 30 years, almost 30 years, 29 years in the U.S. Navy. I spent a lot of time afloat, and in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, the Soviet Navy was known for leaving Russia and then going to the Mediterranean, but then they would go sit at anchorages in port. Whereas the U.S. Navy at the time, we were always steaming, always moving, always operating, flying aircraft, jets off of our aircraft carriers, helicopters off our destroyers, doing anti-submarine warfare drills, anti-air warfare drills, working with other navies. So China now, since 2009, they've been sending ships to the Gulf of Aden to operate. They have been sending ships 3,000, 4,000 miles away from home, operating for 2 or 3 months at a time. And before the virus, they would then send those ships up to the Mediterranean, to the Baltic. We saw, and I was on board in Kiel in 2019. I was on board the frigate Binzhou, and I was on that ship for several hours, and the Chinese crew reminded me of the crews that I had served with in the U.S. Navy. Their ship had been obviously at sea for quite a long time, but it was still painted and looked, they had prepared it to pull into port. So they had pride in their platform. They were seasoned mariners, and they had this kind of experience. Now,
we also lack a clear vision of how to reply to the CTP's aggression, both in the military and civilian realms. Why do you think that is? What is your take on that? The CCP has a huge, modern, advanced manufacturing base. It has the necessary engineers and a diligent workforce. Also a committed and focused, aggressive government with deep pockets for its military and an egotistical leader who wants to make history. He wants to be treated equally to Mao and Deng, his predecessors. Don't you think so? Thank you for watching. Did you like our interviews we played in this video? In the comments, you will find links to all of them. Enjoy. See you in the next video.